How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the trickiest podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the Genre Essentials, where we look at a specific genre of music, talk about 12 albums that we think are essential to said genre, and, just give our thoughts, opinions, give some recommendations, and, that's the basic gist of it. But, Nostalgia, what genre are we doing today?
Well, it's a little bit trippy, a little bit hoppy. It's trip hop, baby.
Hey, baby. Wee bit of trip hop. Nothing more to add there. Do you want to just get right into it?
Yeah, for sure. I will mention, this video coincided with my trip to Bristol, so I've done some field research. I saw a bunch of buses heading towards Portishead, so that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, I'm well researched.
I'm sure you are, my friend. I'm sure you are. But with that in mind, let's just get right into the shit. And first record that we have here is Melting Moment by Poison Girlfriend, which came out in 1992. This is the debut EP/album from Japanese singer-songwriter Noriko Sakaguchi, better known as Poison Girlfriend, and it was released under Victor Entertainment. Melting Moment is a project that came out a little bit after trip-hop was really established as a genre, as I'm sure you're aware, Massive Attack, who we will talk about later on, pioneered trip-hop massively with their debut Blue Lines in 1991. Trip-hop may have originally emerged from the Bristol underground, but since it's derived from down-tempo, many music scenes around the world were fairly early, including Japan, which is obviously where Poison Girlfriend resides, and she was pretty much bringing forth a more kind of ethereal vibe than her contemporaries at the time. And while Melting Moment isn't a perfect project, it's still a really good project that has some fantastic moments. It's a 35-minute project, and within those 35 minutes we're hit with the aforementioned ethereal vibes, while also being accompanied by some eclectic influences as well as some crystalline vocals from Noriko, which absolutely match the tone, the atmosphere, and the sensual but nocturnal lyrics. At its best, it's absolutely breathtaking, like the opening track especially, which I adore. I've been listening to that track so much lately. And I really love the other influences that bleed into the project, like some house and kind of techno-ish production quirks, which are so 90s, and a lot of kind of ambient pop ideas. It doesn't follow the trip-hop template to a T, really. Like, the only track on here that feels like true and blue trip-hop is Those Were the Days, but with the way it presents itself and the way it comes off, it does feel like a trip-hop record to me. It just kind of bends the rules a bit, which is always welcomed. Even then, personally, I think that the project can falter a bit. There's some production on this album that is a bit dated, and while it's not a huge issue, it does come off that way in some moments of the production, and it can feel a bit off to me in that regard. Given how airy the sonic palette is, there are some tracks that I don't think are as memorable as others, and it's definitely deserving of a mention as well as an essential trip-hop record. I do feel like it's not a major staple in the genre, unlike a bunch of other trailblazers from other notable acts who we'll talk about later on. But even then, I do really like Melting Moment. I've come back to it a decent amount, specific songs, but the ones that are being my best tracks. And given how early it was around the time trip-hop came to be, it deserves a nod as one of the genre's hidden gems.
Again, we're starting off with quite a niche album in the genre, and one which may not ring any bells for a lot of people. But yeah, it's quite surprising that this project predates a lot of the genre's more iconic staples. And in my opinion, this debut mini LP from Poison Girlfriend is really great. It's personally one of I found a lot of new albums doing this episode, and of the bunch, I think this might be my favorite that I'm hearing for the first time. And personally, it's up there as one of my favorite in the genre and in the episode period. It presents a super dreamy yet hazy and cold approach to the trip hop sound, conjuring up visceral images of like snowy city streets in the early hours of the day. Late enough for the sun to have risen, but too early to be out and about. That kind of 6 a.m., 7 a.m. vibe. And yeah, it just transports you into another world. It's so damn comforting, both lyrically and vocally. It's about as gentle and serene as it gets. It just all feels like you're floating through ethereal soundscapes beautifully. And speaking of soundscapes, this thing sounds to me so pristine even by today's standards. A lot of trip hop goes for that analog vintage aesthetic, but Melting Moment from start to finish to me wouldn't sound out of place if it came out in the 2010s. It's just so pristine production wise. There's very little sampling to be found throughout, yet still instrumentally displays a density and a layered style that's synonymous with hip hop. And yeah, I know a lot of people are waiting to hear our thoughts about the big boys of the genre, understandably so, but I think this is an album that shouldn't be glossed over because there's some absolute magic on here, and yeah, I personally absolutely love it.
Alright, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks are Hardly Ever Smile Without You, Fact 2, and Qua. My least favourite track is Those Were the Days.
Oh, my favorite tracks are Hardly Ever Smile Without You, The Future Is Now, and Those Were the Days is by far my favorite. My least favorite track is Koi.
Okay then.
Alright. Speaking of the big boys, ow, I punched my desk.
Well
Out
done,
of sheer excitement.
dummy.
Dummy,
Well done, you fucking dummy.
Don't spoil it, Nick. Yeah, it's Dummy, the iconic debut studio album released in 1994 by Bristol legends Portishead, and an album that is largely responsible for helping to popularize trip hop. Yeah, to a lot of people, this is the quintessential trip hop album, and yeah, for good reason. You can definitely see why. Its sound palette, its formula, its atmosphere, it gets everything so right. In order to hit all the sweet spots it does. The whole album just feels covered in such a dark, unnerving, and nocturnal mist, but that foundation is what allows the vocal work to shine in such a beautifully haunting and intimately delivered way. Beth Gibbons' voice is just absolutely out of this world. It's incredible. It's filled with such raw passion that is given the perfect amount of room to shine on this album's more spacious and understated instrumentals. Instrumentals which are also absolutely out of this world. Every instrument, as well as the vocals, both sampled and from Beth herself, have such a memorable sound and tone on this project. And a lot of that incredible vintage sound comes down to the production techniques used throughout. A lot of what we hear on this album are samples, but there's also plenty of live instrumentation the band recorded too. And in order to get the sound they were looking for, the band printed the live music they recorded onto vinyl and then sampled that vinyl. And the end result speaks for itself. The sound palette of this album is so unique, and it's definitely in no small part thanks to that technique that they used. It's such a wonderful album. It's so mystical, so lush, it's so haunting, and so much more complex than, you know, it might immediately portray itself as. But yeah, it's an absolute classic in the genre. If there's one album that you need to hear, I would say it's this one. So yeah, Dummy, fuck yeah.
Yeah, you're speaking my language, let's be honest here. Yeah, Dummy is a massive staple in the trip-hop genre. It's part of a big three of albums that pioneered the genre, including Blue Lines and the album we're talking about after this, and for years it has been held in high regard as one of trip-hop's crowning achievements, and for good reason, because Dummy is an absolutely incredible album. And for me, it's my personal favourite trip-hop album ever made. So you know I have a ton of nice things to say about it. You know, Portishead were very unique in the early stages of trip-hop, as the band's sound really brought forth influences from numerous generations of artists into one thing. You know, Jeff Barrows was influenced heavily by hip-hop like Public Enemy and sample-based production. Beth Gibbons was majorly inspired by singers like Nina Simone, Elizabeth Fraser, and Janis Joplin, and Adrian Utley was a jazz guitarist who cites rock guitarists like Jimi Hendrix and the late Jeff Beck as influences too. You know, so all of what made these individuals the artists that they are would culminate into what Dummy would sound like. this noir-like album that uses samples, guitars, and pained, soulful vocals, and it is an incredible album from front to back. Dummy has some incredible staying power on almost every single song. It even sounds kind of alien in contrast with everything else that their contemporaries were doing, and the uniqueness of what the group were doing on this album really makes it stand out. Plus, some of those production techniques, like like printing out a lot of what they did on wax and then kind of like messing with it, like that really makes it sound unique. And not to mention, it sounds fantastic. The production is incredible. It takes a lot of liberties with the sounds of drums and the samples. There's an intentional rough to the album when it comes to those aspects, but they all blend so perfectly together as a unit beside each other. And I was about to say Geth Gibbons. Beth Gibbons' vocals, which are phenomenal. She's probably one of my favorite singers ever. Let's be honest. Not Geth Bibbins, Beth Gibbons.
Not to be confused.
Not to be confused. The pure emotion, pain, and soul in her voice is really captivating, and the pain is even further illustrated by the songwriting, which is often just longing and just about heartbreak. And if I could describe this album, it's like a dark 50s noir romance movie made for the 90s. The individual tracks in this album are nothing short of incredible. Sour Times, Mysterons, Strangers, It Could Be So Sweet, Wandering Star Roads, and of course the iconic Glory Box, just to name a bunch. They're all incredible, and there's barely a moment on this album that feels weak or dull. It's just so entrancing. It's genuinely one of the most perfect albums that you could hear in trip hop, and I adore it. It's amazing. It's one of the go-to albums that I've been into ever since I started getting into trip hop and getting into Portishead. And with that, if you couldn't tell already, it's essential. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Dummy are Sour Times, It Could Be Sweet, and Glory Box. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks on Dummy are Mysterons, Sour Times, and Glory Box, and I do not have any least favorites.
Well, hey,
indeed.
Alright, we're moving on to another trailblazer for trip hop, and that is Maxinquaye by Tricky. This is the debut album from Bristol producer, rapper, and major pioneer for trip hop, Tricky. It was released in 1995 and it came out under Island Records. To say that Tricky is one of the most influential figures in the world of trip hop would be putting it lightly, to say the least. He was around the Bristol scene since the beginning, and he was well known for working on Massive Attack's Blue Lines when he was a somewhat member, not really, of the group. It took a little bit for Tricky to come out with his own stuff, but he eventually did in 1995 with Maxinquaye, which reads as a very personal album, and that's the case from the way this album is tonally, and with the title of the album too, as it's named after Tricky's mother, who committed suicide when he was a boy. Maxinquaye is definitely an album that it takes a unique approach to trip hop, as there's some production and tinges that pull from industrial and even dub, and the former especially makes the album come off very mechanical and cold, which is clearly what Tricky was going for, given the subject matter of the songwriting as well as the tone of the instrumentals. Tricky wrote the lyrics that are on this album, but Martina Topley Bird would sing the lyrics, and her vocals are one of the most prominent parts of the album, and she sounds fantastic on it. Tricky does bring some vocal contributions as well, and what they bring to the table matches the ideas and the tones of the tracks. At its best, Maxinquaye has a lot of fantastic tracks to its name. It has some eclectic choices of ideas and samples. There's even a track in this album that uses the same Isaac Hayes sample that Portishead used on Glory Box. And there's a track on here that samples Michael Jackson's Bad as well, just to name something. The instrumental weaves into... No, excuse me. The instrumentals weave into something really interesting and unique sounding, and while not all of it lands for me personally, it does have some great moments that do land. I think some tracks do end up not being as standout for me and kind of blend in, especially in the latter half of the album, which is admittedly a bit too sluggish for my liking, but nonetheless, Tricky puts forth some brilliant tracks, a unique sounding album in the trip hop field, and one that definitely deserves its flowers as a trip hop essential.
Yeah. This project seriously grew on me a lot. I was a little lukewarm on it on first listen, but after consecutive listens, I can safely say this is a standout in the genre and one of its essential moments. I didn't immediately love it. I think a lot of what it was trying to do flew right by me on first listen, but something just clicked on my second listen. I found myself entranced by its hypnotic sampling and its borderline ominous atmosphere. And again, every sample, every instrument, every vocal track is crafted to sound absolutely gorgeous, as is the case with a lot of these albums. But to me, this album's most defining aspect, however, is it's very raw, almost sensual edge. A lot of the tracks on here are heavily tied thematically to sex and drugs and just sheer pain and emotion. The drum sampling throughout is driving, it's gritty, but it also at times manages to not take itself too serious and keeps the listener on toes. A good example of that being the track Black Steel, which completely throws trip hop out the window and gives us a very industrial and rebellious alternative rock take on Public Enemy's 1989 single Black Steel, in the Hour of Chaos. It's sandwiched between two super atmospheric and somber tracks, and yeah, it's one of the many standouts on the project, and it just kind of goes to show just how eclectic this album and tricky is with his ideas. And you know, despite not initially making my best tracks in this album, Overcome has grown to become one of my favorite trip hop tracks, period.
Yeah, that
yeah,
song is
in my
incredible.
opinion,
It's one of my
it's
favorites
slightly
too.
better than the original version, Found on Protection by Massive Attack. It's just so fucking gorgeous. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And one thing remains present throughout all of these tracks, though, and that is Tricky's incredible production and Marina Topley Bird's hauntingly serene vocals, which honestly elevate the album so much. I don't think Maxinquaye would have ever reached any of its potential without her voice. She suits the soundscapes so perfectly. And yeah, I think that the two are a match made in heaven on this project. Yeah, it's a brilliant album. It's definitely a essential in the genre, and I can now say that I do very much love it.
All right. With that in mind, my favorite tracks from Maxinquaye are Overcome, Hell is Around the Corner, and Aftermath. My least favorite track is Struggling.
My favorite tracks are Overcome, Black Steel, and Feed Me. My least favorite track is also Struggling. All right. Up next, we're venturing off to the US of A.
Well, hey.
And the next album is Viva La Woman, the debut studio album from Japanese-American band Cibo Matto, released in 1996. All right. When we're doing these episodes and talking about 12 albums within the same genre, it's always nice to hear some albums that kind of try to do something different and stand out in some way, just to spice these episodes up. And Viva La Woman most certainly does that. The thing that immediately makes it stand out from the projects we've talked about up to this point is its very almost J-pop-esque playfulness and just wacky nature. Vocalist Miro Hitori's vocals alternate from hushed and intimate whispers to eccentric rapping throughout, and the vast majority of this album lyrically is about food, with track titles ranging from Birthday Cake and Apple to Beef Jerky and Artichoke. It doesn't take itself too seriously at all, which I very much appreciate, but what makes it all the more striking is how elegant this album is instrumentally. There's a very entertaining juxtaposition happening there between the two. The obvious highlight of this album is, of course, Sugar Water, an absolute masterpiece of a track with incredibly tasteful string sampling, an unforgettably smooth chorus, and yeah, it's definitely a staple of trip hop as a whole, in my opinion. And unfortunately, I do think it stands quite a bit above the rest of the tracks on this album, but that's not to say there's not some fantastic moments that follow, like Birthday Cake or Theme. This album just it really stands out for its playfulness above all else. Instrumentally, I think it's kind of akin to what we've heard and what we will continue to hear, but I think the ethos that Cibo Matto bring to the table definitely makes this an album worth listening to and worth checking out. And it also it definitely stands out because of its wackier moments, like White Pepper Ice Cream, which I still am not really sure about the concept of that as a flavor. It does stand out amongst Sugar Water and Birthday Cake, which all sound pretty good. and that one sounds pretty horrid. But the track is in itself very lush, incredibly hypnotic. And while overall this may not be my favorite album on the list, I still think that Sugar Water is perfect, and a lot of what this album brings to the table you don't really find in the genre. It's playfulness, it's just a lackadaisical approach to songwriting, and it's just ethos of fun above anything else is a unique twist on the trip hop sound. So yeah, definitely would recommend it for that reason.
So yeah, we move on from the depressing, melancholic side of trip hop to something a bit more fun-loving, and that comes in the form of Cibo Matto's Viva la Woman. Cibo Matto are a group that I remember seeing get mentions from a bunch of people in relation to trip-hop gems, particularly their sophomore effort, Stereo Type A, which I have yet to hear, but we've chosen Viva la Woman for the Essentials list, and yeah, it's pretty good to say the least, and everyone should definitely give this record a go for something that's a bit more on the fun and catchy side, and something that's a bit more eccentric. Plus, it has some absolutely essential songs, in my opinion, like the aforementioned Sugar Water, which, yeah, that song's perfect. That song is just... It's so good. You might recognize it if you're a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but, you know, just listen to it anyway.
Yeah, that's where I found about them. Because remember, if you were a listener of the stream, listener or watcher of the streams, we actually did a reaction to Sugar Water a few months back. My girlfriend was the one who recommended it, and yeah, she found it through Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And here we are, it's come full circle.
Very based. Alongside being a more kind of carefree and fun kind of album, it does dip its toes into more kind of expansive and ambitious ideas, particularly with the 10-minute song called Theme, and there's even some ideas that stem from more hip-hop, but it does often thrive for me when it's being more of a trip-hop effort, and that's exemplified with the production choices on the best cuts and with the quirky characteristics that gives this album some personality. And if you're taking this album very seriously, then I feel like you won't get much from it. But it's pretty clear that this was meant to be a fun, carefree album. I mean, every single song is named after a food. Like, come on. So yeah, like I mentioned, Sugar Water is absolutely amazing. Oh my fucking god, it's so good. It's genuinely one of the best trip-hop songs of all time for me, and it just gets better for me with every single listen. That chorus is so smooth. Alongside that, there's also other really great tracks, like the opening track and Beef Jerky. With all that in mind, though, I do think this album does kind of overdo things a bit. Like, there's some songs that could be a bit grating to listen to, and the aforementioned Theme is a bit of an overindulgent mess of a song, in my opinion. You know, it was promising at first, but it never really did much beyond being promising, in my opinion. Aside from that, I don't have too much else to say about it. Cibo Matto definitely bring a different vibe from a lot of artists you'll see in this list, and I think that you'll appreciate a change of pace from what the other records brought to the table. It's not amazing, but I think it's really good. I enjoy it. All in all, pretty good, and it's essential. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Viva La Woman are Beef Jerky, Sugar Water, and The Candyman. My least favourite track is Theme.
My favourite tracks are Sugar Water, Birthday Cake, and Theme. My least favourite track is Artichoke.
Okay, and now, move on to a fucking massive boy, if I do say so myself. We finally have them on here. Mezzanine by Massive Attack.
Woo.
This is the third studio album from the founding fathers of what we now know as trip-hop, Massive Attack, and it was released in 1996 under Virgin Records. About fucking time we got to Massive Attack. Jesus, man. You know, Massive Attack really could have got onto this list with any of their 90s albums, really. Especially Blue Lines, which, if you didn't know already, was basically the album that invented the damn genre. But we decided to go with the album that is for sure the group's most critically acclaimed record, Mezzanine, and for good reason, because this is one of Massive Attack's more unique albums, and in the grander scheme of trip-hop, it's one of the genre's defining highs. If there was an album that I could compare it to from what we've talked about, I definitely bring up Maxinquaye, as Massive Attack are also somewhat taking to the post-industrial and kind of dubby influences that Maxinquaye had presented within its tracklist. But in contrast, Massive Attack made something that felt more surreal alongside the nocturnal and ominous soundscapes. It's in contrast with the other records Massive Attack made before Mezzanine, they implored influences that we conventionally saw from trip-hop like soul, R&B, funk, so on, but this album saw them focus more on a harsher sound that was more akin to rock leanings, and while it maintained more R&B flourishes when it came to the vocals, the instrumentals were far more harsh, while also maintaining the psychedelic kind of surrealism that Massive Attack came out with. And when it comes to the way that this album sounds, I'd say it makes the album feel unique, and as a whole, it is fantastic. It's more grim undertones bode well for the instrumental palette of the album, which do feel very cohesive while at the same time felt very dynamic. The dubby leanings across this album are fantastic. The drum samples sound fantastic. The bass lines are sick. I love the bursts of guitars that happen on certain tracks, and the way that it paces itself as well is something to take note of, as it engulfs you in a lot of these songs. Vocalists across this album sound fantastic as well. They match the tone of the surreal and nocturnal instrumentation. And of course, the songs in this album at its best are phenomenal. Rising Sun, Inertia Creeps, Dissolved Girl, Black Milk, Mezzanine, and of course the band's most popular song, Teardrop, which is phenomenal. I don't go back to Mezzanine as much as I should, and while I personally prefer Blue Lines as an album, Mezzanine's achievements can't go understated. And as a whole, it's fantastic. It's a unique album. It's easy to see this album as one of trip-hop's essentials, because it is. It's a crowning achievement for it, even.
Yeah, Massive Attack are a band that need absolutely no introduction to anyone even remotely familiar with trip-hop. They're arguably the single most important artist when it comes to the genre's development. As you said earlier, the band's debut album, Blue Lines, deserves a massive, massive shout out for being basically the first ever major trip-hop project. And by all means, it's also very much a genre essential. It's just that our one album per artist rule is final, and that's that. And there is no way that Mezzanine could ever miss out. This project is absolutely brilliant. In my eyes, it's trip-hop at its most gritty, dark, and sinister, with heavy influences from most notably industrial and dub music, but also post-punk in a lot of places. It uses these eclectic styles to create dark and oftentimes suspenseful soundscapes that sound so anxious and intensely unnerving, but incredibly exhilarating at the same time. There's also just moments of sheer beauty throughout, somber and nocturnal beauty that you may come to expect from trip-hop again. And a big source of that beauty, especially on tracks like Teardrops and Black Milk, comes from the additional vocalists the band brought on board, all of which absolutely kill it and perfectly suit the atmosphere of the album. It's an absolute bona fide classic, as essential as it gets in terms of trip-hop, in terms of the 90s as a whole. It's an incredible album, and it's one that you have to listen to if you have even a passing interest in hip-hop. It's about as important as essential as it gets.
Do you mean trip-hop? Because you said
I
hip-hop.
mean trip-hop, yeah. Best and worst tracks.
Alright, with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Mezzanine are Rising Sun, Teardrop, and Group 4. Least favourite track is Exchange.
My favourite tracks are Angel, Teardrop, and Black Milk. I do not have a least favourite track. Alright. Up next, we have Beat, the second studio album by American band Bowery Electric, released November 12th, 1996, by Cranky Records.
Not the King Crimson one?
No. That's a different episode. Link in description. Probably won't be. Definitely won't be, actually. Another album that does something completely new with the trip-hop sound, as on Beat, Bowery Electric combines it with aspects of two genres which we've already done essential episodes on, shoegaze and ambient.
Woo!
And the result is something that sounds wholly unique and refreshing, prioritizing atmosphere above all else and completely stripping back some of the playful and infectious aspects of albums like Viva the Woman or Maxinquaye, and instead we get a grainy, looming and repetitive guitar droning album with mesmerizingly cold vocal work and hypnotically rhythmic trip-hop percussion. This album's heavy ambient influences really make it stand out as perhaps the most slow-burning album of the lot. It uses the trip-hop sound to enhance the meditative and repetitive sounds of its droning, as opposed to making it like the real focus and meat and bones of the project. It's an absolute must here in the genre, especially in order to see, just what can be done with that trip hop sound, because while it is as a genre quite niche and defined, there also is a room for exploring different ideas within it, asterisk with a lot of genres, and I think beat is a perfect example of what the combination of trip hop, shoegaze, and ambient can sound like, and it sounds great.
All right. Beat is for sure one of the more expansive albums that we have for you on the Essentials list, as trip-hop is not the only major genre that defines this album, like you mentioned, as it's taking from a lot of all-over-the-place influences in terms of sound, but it's styles that work practically in unison with the trip-hop sound across Beat, as there's so much ground being covered by Bowery Electric. And yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic album with that in mind. It's one of my favorites on the list. It's one of my favorites on the list. I forgot what I was meant to say after that, but fuck it.
Happens.
I had a brain fart moment, people. My bad. Yeah, Bowery Electric before this album came out were more so a space rock shoegaze band that were influenced by post rock as well, and those three definitely make themselves known in this album. But trip hop makes its presence known on a few tracks here, as well as structures and ideas that follow dronisms and predominantly ambient atmospheres and textures also come into play, and they all culminate tremendously across this album. It's really got some great things going for it when it comes to the overall sound, and its often lethargic feel gives way to some absolutely hypnotic track. It's very ominous sounding too. A lot of trip hop albums are ominous, but this one is ominous, and I really dig every idea and track on this album. Really, the trip hop edge definitely comes through in the drums in this album and with some of the vocals, but even then the ambient drone and spaciousness gives it something different texturally and sonically. It's definitely one of the more unique albums on the list in that regard, and it really stands out as a gem, not just for trip hop or whatever other genres are on this album, but also as a gem for the 90s in general. And honestly, it fucking goes, in my opinion, and more people need to know about it, if I'm being honest. I can't even state it that much. Sorry. I can't even slate it that much for anything, really. Not even for a track that I wasn't a fan of, because to be honest, I was a fan of every song on here. I was really into it. I thought it was really damn great and consistent for me. And there's a ton of great tracks in here, like the title track, Empty Words, Fear of Flying, Black Light, and the 16-minute ambient closer postscript. Overall, this was fantastic. Loved what was being presented here, and I would be very unhappy if y'all missed out on it, as it's grown to be a favorite of mine from the list.
You don't want to make Mick unhappy.
With that in mind, you don't want to make me sad. I'm a poor soul. Don't do this to me. My favorite tracks from Beat are the title track, Fear of Flying, and Postscript. Least favorite track is Inside Out.
My favorite tracks are Empty Words, Fear of Flying, and Black Light. My least favorite track is Looped.
And yeah, we're going to move on to the next one, which is Sounds of Satellites by Laika. This is the sophomore album from UK trip-hop band Laika. It came out in 1997 and it was released under Two Pure Records. From one expansive trip-hop record to another, although Sounds of Satellites is probably something that feels akin to that trip-hop label than, say, Beat, it still rakes in some pretty interesting influences either way, and for the most part, it's a pretty solid record, all in all. Now, this is definitely an instance where I hadn't heard of the artist prior to checking them out, and just from this album alone, they do offer some pretty interesting ideas to the trip-hop fold. It utilizes a lot of sounds that we typically see in the genre, like downtempo and dub. There's even some ideas that stem from IDM slightly, but that influence is more so minor, in my opinion, and of course there's a ton of ambient inclusions as well. Vocally, Margaret Fiedler does a really great job across this album and adds to the overall vibe of these tracks. There's songs that exhibit a bit more lengthy structures at points, and there's some pretty interesting use of different time signatures that pull up as well, which hasn't really been a prevalent thing in any of the albums that we've talked about. Love me an uncommon time signature. Plus, as far as the songs go themselves, there's a lot of really great moments in the tracks that are, all in all, just consistently like in that similar like nocturnal vein that you would typically see in trip hop. Tracks like Prairie Dog, the incredible Ambient Breather, the blissful almost sleepy, excuse me, the blissful almost sleeping, which is somewhat dream pop like. Blood and Bones as well, Shut Off Curl Up, which is also a really great True and Blue trip hop cut, and a couple more tracks. Also, apologies if these just seem weird. I think the notes I've written up are just a little fucky. I was like sleep deprived when I wrote this.
I have those moments sometimes.
God.
I'm like, I hope no one... There's times where I'm like, I hope no one's listening right now. What the fuck am I saying? It happens.
Yeah, shit happens. And just know, eclectic album. Lots of cool shit. I suppose I wouldn't call this one of my favorites in the list either, to be honest. It's a very good record. As it goes on, I feel like... Sorry. But as it goes on, again, I feel like the album doesn't really maintain its consistency. Some tracks and their ideas come off a little bit redundant to me, and while they're all well produced and put together, they just don't really stand out to me fully. Also, as far as trip hop goes, Sounds of Satellites isn't exactly the most like groundbreaking in the genre, but even then, it does bring some cool ideas to the table, and I think it's pretty good. I enjoy a lot of what Laika had to offer on this album. So yeah, 'twas good.
Just like you, Laika is a band that I never heard about in any capacity until preparations for this very episode. But I have to say, in my opinion, Sound of Silence, what do we fucking say? In my opinions, I said in my opinions, plural. Alright, compose yourself. In my opinion, Sounds of Satellites is another hidden gem in this genre's essentials episode. It doesn't really take all too much creative liberty when it comes to genre influences like a lot of the albums we have or will talk about, but within that trip hop formula, it pretty much gets everything spot on. So many of the tracks on here are built on incredibly rhythmic and gritty foundations when it comes to the beats and the bass work, constantly driving the album forwards and again effectively adding a sense of hypnotism to the mix. And Laika built off this foundation with winding and lush soundscapes, dream pop inspired synth and guitar work, and a passionate yet hushed vocal delivery throughout, with each track presenting its own array of samples and atmospheres, each engraving themselves into your psyche as this album takes you on a floating trip through space. It's like a dark yet viscerally beautiful dream, and one which is comforting yet very, very cold. It's a brilliant record, another hidden gem. Also, one of my favorite album covers ever. I fucking love this thing. It looks so much like the album sounds. This kind of mystical dream world inside of a snow globe. I love it. And yeah, I absolutely recommend this album. If you're a fan of just the raw trip hop sound, then there's definitely going to be a lot to enjoy about this project, because it does pretty much follow that formula, but it follows it well.
Alright, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Sounds of Satellites are Breather, Almost Sleeping, and Blood and Bones. My least favorite track is Bedbugs.
My favorite tracks are Breather, Out of Sight, and Snowblind, and Almost Sleeping. No least favorite tracks. Alright. Up next, we have Science Fiction, the debut album from British outfit UNKLE, released in 1998, with the majority of the music on this album being composed by then member DJ Shadow. Yeah.
Oh my god.
This project's a hell of a trip. That wasn't a pun, actually. That wasn't meant to be a pun. I just realized. Yeah, UNKLE's sound is super grimy and filled with influences from the likes of experimental hip-hop and alternative rock. And the former being especially notable, thanks, again, in no small part to the DJ Shadow connection. His aura is all over this thing. It's got that signature late 90s, early 2000s underground hip-hop grit. And then there's tracks like Nursery Rhyme or Lonely Soul, which have a more bombastic and alternative rock style overall. In fact, pretty much every track on here individually brings something new to the table, with this being one of those projects that just keeps throwing new ideas at you and new sounds at you, each presenting something fresh and exciting, yet ultimately still feeling cohesive as an album and still, having that album flow, album cohesion. It doesn't feel like a random compilation album. Everything is kind of tied together. Not really sound-wise, but more so aesthetic-wise and overall feel-wise. And this album's just constant, bombastic and constant surprising nature is definitely helped by its star-studded lineup of guest vocalists, which include Tom York, MickyT, Richard Ashcroft of The Verve, Badly Drawn Boy, and more. And even Ian Brown of the Stone Roses fame features on a deluxe version of this album. And all of these artists quite obviously bring something completely new to the table. And all of it is kind of blended together into one cohesive unit somehow. I never thought I'd hear an album with Tom York and MickyT, but you know what? It works. It works quite well. It's quite a jarring experience overall, because obviously all of these artists coexisting on one album is obviously going to be jarring, but it is worked together perfectly. And the core of this album, that DJ Shadow magic, is present throughout, and it absolutely kicks ass, and it definitely is a standout in trip hop when it comes to the late 90s. It completely brings something new to the table, and in my opinion, it had a bit of a big impact on a little known trip hop artist that would emerge in the 2000s, possibly named after a primate. We'll see about that.
Possibly. Potentially.
Especially when it comes to the heavy use of features, but I'll say no more. This is a great album.
Say no more. In many ways, when trip hop was first becoming its own thing, it was the UK's response to US hip hop, and even though trip hop did borrow some techniques and production ideas from hip hop, it did manage to feel like its own thing. Obviously, UK hip hop would definitely become more prominent down the road with grime and drill and all that. But, trip hop was essentially the response that the UK wanted to make to the US. And, but in contrast with a lot of stuff in the genre, this record leans more into that US hip hop take out of any record on this list would be. Well, I just did it again. Fuck's sake. A record that I feel like leans more into the US hip-hop take out of any record on this list is the one we're talking about now, Psyence Fiction, from UNKLE, which is a very good album on its own and does manage to stand out amongst its contemporaries for that transparent link to the US hip-hop roots. For me, that link is shown by the production that the one and only DJ Shadow provides in this album, as well as the appearances of primarily US-based rappers like Kool G Rap and even MickyT of the Beastie Boys. It leans a lot into that US sound with its samples and its breakbeats, but it does wrap itself around contextually with the trip-hop ideas that push themselves forth, and as well as that, they take some nods from alternative rock as well, with some tracks here being true and blue alt rock. It's another varied album to say the least, and the variedness really does give way to some interesting ideas, and as well as that, its best moments are fantastic. Not to mention, there's some great appearances from Tom York and Ian Brown of the Stone Roses. The production is fantastic. There's great layers and textures to match the samples and the instrumentation. I especially love what DJ Shadow was bringing here, because his production is fucking elite. Introducing is an example of that. I think the record does have a couple of tracks that I'm not too keen on, but what I did love was really great, and what it offers in the grander scheme of our list is very good. So yeah, really great stuff on this one. I like the way it leans more into US hip-hop ideas and alt-rock ideas while maintaining that trip-hop edge, and while I don't think it's entirely memorable, I did find myself enjoying a majority of it. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Psyence Fiction are Bloodstain, Rabbit in Your Headlights, and Be There. I know it's a bonus track. I don't care. It slaps. Worst track, I'd have to go with Chaos.
My favorite tracks are Unreal, Lonely Soul, and Chaos. Don't really have any of these favorites.
Alright then, we're going to move on to the last 4 records we have in the Essentials. And the first one we're going to be talking about here is Perdition City by Ulver. This is the 5th album from Norwegian black metal turned electronic band Ulver, and it was released in 2000 under Gesture Records. Ulver are a band that I've been meaning to get into recently, not only because their black metal works are famously very essential, but also some of their electronic works, and that is an artistic change of pace, if I've ever seen one, to the dismay of specky black metal purists who hate change and can go fuck themselves simultaneously. Perdition City is a record that I've had my eyes on for a bit now, not only because it's a very well-praised album and because the album cover really catches the eyes, but also because it was a landmark album for Ulver's sonic exploration into more electronic music, and finally we get to hear it for the essentials, and yeah, it's really good. Not perfect by any means, and not one of my favorites on the list though, because there are segments in the last few tracks in the album that do kind of turn me off, mainly a sample, a production choice, and some of the vocal passages, as I found them to be a bit campy, to say the least. But even then, there's still so much to praise about Perdition City. I think that from a production standpoint, okay, Perdition City is fantastic, and the ideas that the band bring to the table is nothing short of interesting and really expansive. They delve into trip-hop, ambient, industrial, jazz, and so on, and its best moments are really great. The textures, the structures, the ideas are all done very well, and I think that the opening track, Lost in Moments, is really the crown jewel of this album, as that particular song is phenomenal. Personally, I think like the rest of the tracklist doesn't really live up to that like perfection, but honestly, Lost in Moments is just incredible. The latter half I don't find as interesting as the first, but they're still all well done. Well done tracks are on here. They're all well made. They sound good. The other criticisms that I have still stand alongside this, but even then, Perdition City deserves its merits, and at the end of the day, it's a very good piece of trip-hop / electronic music.
Despite being primarily known for their black metal output in the 90s, Ulver have, in the years since, proven to be a band not interested in containing themselves into any one bubble. These days, they're more frequently releasing material that is in a synth-pop-centric style, but the band did go through a lot of switch-ups to get to where they are today, and on their way there, 2000s Perdition City came out, and it's their pretty much one and only endeavor into a trip-hop sound, but not just any trip-hop sound. This thing sounds absolutely extraterrestrial. It sounds futuristic even today, and completely surreal, with heavy influences from ambient, industrial, and especially dark jazz, and with vocal work definitely taking a back seat, to say the least. This album just effortlessly engulfs you in its indescribable soundscapes and atmospheres. It sounds absolutely brilliant, and it's another example of what can be done with the trip-hop style. You know, despite its very niche and specific definition, it is a sound which is all-encompassing and can be done to great effect in a lot of different styles, and this definitely showcases that, because honestly it cannot really be compared to anything else on its list. It's really in a field of its own, and personally I absolutely love it, and it's another one of the highlights in the genre, and a great ambassador of taking trip-hop into the next century, as it's the first album of the 2000s we're talking about. It's brilliant, it's unsettling. Even after multiple listens, it still has that unsettling and uncomfortable just cold on me. It still puts me in this kind of sense of unease and anxiousness, and I love it. I don't want it to ever stop. It's one of the highlights for me, and yeah, let's go.
Okay then. With that in mind, my favorite tracks from Perdition City. What?
Black metal in the bin. Trip hop's new.
Black metal in the fucking bin, man. Let's go.
We're kidding. For next
Ooh. Okay, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Perdition City are Lost in Moments, again, masterpiece. Hallways of Always and The Future Sounds of Music. My least favorite track is Dead City Centers.
My favorite tracks are Lost in Moments, Porn Piece of Scars of Cold Kisses, The Future Sounds of Music. My least favorite track is Cataleptic. Right, you know, we hinted at this earlier, but
Yeah, we did.
It's time for the primates.
Maybe.
Gorillaz.
It's time for the one and only.
Gorillaz is the self-titled debut studio album by English virtual band Gorillaz, released in 2001, consisting of Jamie Hewlett on playing the pen,
playing the
and of course Damon Albarn doing the singing thing that he likes to do.
That guy who sings.
Yeah, Gorillaz I think needs no introduction. Let's be perfectly honest. Their self-titled debut isn't the first album that comes to mind for a lot of people when the band is mentioned, but when it comes to this episode, I think it's by far the most trip-hoppy of their albums, and it's an influence that is ever present on this project, and one that is less so ever present as the band's career progressed into any direction they felt like, to be honest. But despite the fact that it's often overlooked by admittedly better albums, their only full foray into trip hop is still brilliant, and you know, I don't return to it as much as I do the other albums, and so coming back to it for the first time in maybe like 3 or 4 years was definitely a cool experience, especially when I was more so looking out for the trip hop aspects, and you know, trying to organize notes for it and analyze it a bit further. I definitely found a lot of appeal to this project that I didn't before notice. I think that the band, you know, putting the features that are so ever present in their music from Demon Days onwards kind of on the backseat and doing a lot more of their own thing was something that ultimately led to a more subtle and less bombastic and explorative album, but one that is more so grounded in just Damon Albarn's emotions, his feelings. It's meditative, it's hypnotic, it's somber. It really is a complete shift from the fun, quirky, whatever the hell they feel like Gorillaz that we would come to know. And I think it's still a very important album in discography, and tracks like Tomorrow Comes Today, Clint Eastwood, 192000, and the often overlooked Slow Country are all absolute classics. And you know, the band's way less reliant approach on big name features does have some merit to it in this specific style. It's a great album. It's often overlooked, but it really does bring a lot to the table, and it definitely brought hip hop to a completely new generation in the 2000s.
Trip hop.
Oh my god. Hip hop too, kind of. This one.
A bit, yeah.
It's eclectic. It's quirky, but not as much as you'd expect from the Gorillaz. And above all else, it's an absolute blast to listen to, as all things Gorillaz should be.
So, funny cartoon band time. So, for those that aren't aware, me and Nostalgia, we might be big Gorillaz fans. We dabble. We go to the zoo sometimes. They look pretty cool. They're awesome. I especially grew up on Gorillaz music, and just from saying that, you already know that I really like Gorillaz' self-titled album, which is a good album on its own. And while it isn't the most memorable album from Gorillaz, especially, it does still have a lot of tracks in its tracklist that are fantastic, and for me, it sets itself as like a pseudo template for what Gorillaz would be like in the future. You know, of course, since it's on the trip hop essential, suffice to say there's trip hop on this album. Majority of it is, but for me, Damon Albarn takes a lot of inspiration from all kinds of 90s trip hop and borrows from artists like Portishead and arguably even Cibo Matto. Hell, even Miho Hattori from Cibo Matto makes a cameo on this album on 2000, a banger song, by the way. But, you know, Damon took a lot of these elements and ended up making some really great tracks out of it, some of which are some of the best stuff you'll hear from early Gorillaz, as well as some of their biggest hits. Alongside that, there's a lot of hip-hop influence on this album too, and some of the production and some of the guest performers, which we would see a lot later on Gorillaz albums, and is usually a staple for their albums, the guest features and guest producers especially. But when it comes to the music and self-titled, a lot of it is fantastic. There's so many fantastic moments on here that rank as some of the most essential Gorillaz tracks, like Tomorrow Comes Today, Clint Eastwood, 92000, and there's really great deep cuts that go a bit under the radar when it comes to Gorillaz tracks, like New Genius, for example, which I fucking love. As well as that, the guests on this album are fantastic as well. Names like the aforementioned Miho Hattori come up. Del the Funky Homo Sapien and Dan the Automator are up here as well. Members of Buena Vista Social Club are on this album too. And even Tina Weymouth and Chris France from Talking Heads and Tom Tom Club are on this very album. That blew my mind when I found out. And yeah. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I personally wouldn't consider this album as one of Gorillaz' more memorable albums or as one of their most consistent records, as, you know, admittedly, there's better albums in their discography. But there's tracks on here that are fantastic. There's a lot of great material, lots of great trip-hop and hip-hop on this thing. It really did introduce a whole generation to trip-hop and hip-hop as well, like you mentioned. And it really is the template for what Gorillaz would eventually do later on down the road. But even then, like, it's still a very good album that I do really love. And yeah, it's essential. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Gorillaz self-titled are Tomorrow Comes Today, New Genius, and 192000. I'm sorry to do it to you. Slow Country is probably my favorite.
My favorite track.
I'm sorry.
Are Clint Eastwood, 192000, and Slow Country. My least favorite track is Punk. God, can't believe I've done this.
Oh, fuck. Okay, we're moving on to the final two albums on the Essentials. And next up, we have Music to Make Love to Your Old Lady by Lovage. God, I love it.
I love a bit of Lovage.
This is the debut... Same. This is the debut album from Lovage. It was released in 2001, and it came out under 75 Arc. Now, I might not be the only person who saw this album cover, this album title, and on face value went, what in the name of fuck is this? I've never seen or heard this. Well, Lovage was a short-lived project that featured Nathaniel Merriweather, who, if you didn't know already, is Dan the Automator. Vocalist Jennifer Charles, and a little vocalist man we may have talked about before, or, you know, reacted to his music before, a man named Mike Patton. Not sure if you've heard of him. So, yeah, an interesting lineup of artists on this album, to say the least, and an interesting presentation, to say the least. And after listening to it, I just have to say, this album is great. No other way around it. I think this album is fantastic. I loved it on first listen, and I loved it even more after checking it out, because goddamn, this was really great. You know, if it wasn't already indicative by the title and the name of this project, this album is sexy. And it's sexy in pretty much every aspect you can think of, from the vocals, the production, the themes, and so on. Dabbled with hints of irony here and there, but at the end of the day, this album is a blast, and if you love albums that sound smooth as fuck, well, this is the one for you. I could see why some people might not really dig the album, but the way I see it, you'll get most out of it if you don't take it that seriously and just let yourself get lost in the groovy, sensual, and smooth essence that this album has from front to back. Plus, I think this album is incredibly consistent. There's little skits in between a few songs, but the songs themselves are just amazing to me. There isn't really a moment on the album that feels weak, and every song, at the very least, yep, it's great. And it's mainly because the key components of the songs are just too quality to ignore. You know, Dan the Automator's production is fantastic across this album. It's constantly like slick and smooth and groovy across the board. It's balanced, it sounds crisp, it's psychedelic, and he absolutely killed it across the board. What really sells it for me, though, is the vocals from Jennifer Charles and Mike Patton, who sound amazing on this album. Mike Patton matches the silky smooth production with equal parts style and silky smoothness. He does bring his weird aura sometimes, but I wouldn't be inclined to say it's like the most eccentric Mike Patton has ever sounded, because if you know Mike Patton, yeah. But Jennifer Charles is something else in this project. Her vocals were fucking fantastic on this album, and you could tell she was really into it on this, because she matches what's going on perfectly and makes a lot of the songs a million times better. Plus, the chemistry that Mike and Jennifer have on this album it's off the rails, and it really makes the song so much better for me. There's so many tracks in this thing that, you know, I will for sure be coming back to after this point, and as far as criticisms go, I don't really have any. I don't mind the skits, really, and the music on this thing is just too good to pass up on. So yeah, amazing vocals, amazing production, nice little appearance from Damon Albarn on this thing.
Oh,
and if you hadn't heard, yeah, he was on a little skit. If you didn't notice,
I did not notice.
Well done.
It all comes full circle.
And if you haven't heard it, it does. And if you haven't heard it, change that. It's one of my favorite records on this list. It's one of my favorite trip hop albums ever, and it's in the running for one of the sexiest sounding records ever made. Also, it's essential if that wasn't obvious already.
Yeah, Mike Patton just does whatever Mike Patton wants to do, I guess. Whenever I saw the lineup for this project before listening to it, and yeah, I wasn't surprised really. It made sense to me. But yeah, Lovage almost feels like a super group of sorts, with Dan the Automator of Deltron 3030 fame on production duty, Jennifer Charles of Elysian Fields on vocals, and of course Mike Patton also on vocals. And the cover, the title, they almost feel like they're screaming at you to not take this project seriously in any capacity.
Literally. To
some extent, that is probably good advice. Looking at the cover, I was expecting some sort of sleazy porn movie music, and that's kind of what I got.
I mean, literally, did you not see
the Porno Groove is a subgenre.
Porno Groove.
Yeah. Dan the Automator's production here is super impressive. There's a very heavy lounge influence, subtle hints of soul, and again clear influence taken from 70s Porno Groove, and assembled with such seamlessness and precision and wonderful sampling that despite its obvious kind of tongue-in-cheek nature, there is also a certain level of sophistication to this album's sound. Now onto the vocals. Jennifer Charles really kills it. Her voice is incredibly well suited to this album's sensual and soothing sound, and Mike Patton is a musical chameleon who obviously just blends to whatever he's on. No matter how chaotic or smooth it is, he'll get the job done, and he most certainly does.
6-octave vocal range, just saying.
And this album is not an exception. It showcases his abilities, and in a very unique and tongue-in-cheek way, it provides one of the most well-produced, most well-crafted albums that trip hop has to offer. It's an incredibly unique album. It's one that, as you said, is just smooth as fuck, and one that I cannot get enough of. I absolutely recommend it, and it's another hidden gem amongst quite a lot of hidden gems, actually.
Yeah, for real.
I loved it.
Same here. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Music to Make Love to Your Old Lady by are To Catch a Thief, Lifeboat, and Stroke Your Ace. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks are To Catch a Thief, Book of the Month, and Strangers on a Train. I do not have any least favorite tracks either. Alright, and finally, we have Silent Hill 3, the soundtrack to the 2003 survival horror game of the same name, composed by Japanese composer and producer Akira Yamaoka. Fun fact, Mick. Akira Yamaoka is the first artist to make it onto 2 different genre essentials episodes. The Silent Hill 2 OST made it into the Ambient Essentials, and now the Silent Hill 3 OST closes off the Trip Hop Essentials. I will be honest though, this is probably my least favorite project of the bunch, so I'll keep my thoughts somewhat brief, but it's still very, very good. It's just that, to me, unlike Silent Hill 2, which the album absolutely stood the test of being a self-contained studio album, it still worked very, very well. This one, I feel like, is a little too bloated to have the same effect as an album as it does as a soundtrack, I assume. But it's still very good, and again, I can see how in the context of the game it could be a lot more than very good. It could be amazing, but it is a little bit bloated. However, there's tracks like Letter from the Lost Day and Breeze in Monochrome, amongst others, that prove to be true highlights and add such a unique, cool spin onto that trip-hop genre to make it soundtrack-esque and make it sort of a background noise painting of just this dark and brooding atmosphere that is so ever present in Silent Hill. And yeah, it's a great album. It's a unique sounding album. I mean, I'd hope so, given it's a soundtrack to a psychological horror game. But just my only complaint is that it doesn't flow that well as a solo album. unlike Silent Hill 2's soundtrack, which absolutely does. But it's still something I would definitely recommend. And yeah, it's got some absolute highlights in there.
Yeah, like you mentioned, not the first time we've talked about a Silent Hill soundtrack in a Genre Essentials episode. You know, in the previous episode we talked about Silent Hill 2's soundtrack, and this time we of course have the third game's soundtrack from Akira Yamaoka, which is, you know, it's a decent soundtrack to say the least. But I agree with you, it's probably my least favorite out of, you know, all the albums we've talked about on this list, but it's still pretty solid. It's a fairly eclectic soundtrack with a bunch of sonic inspirations like dark ambient, industrial, alternative rock, and of course trip hop, some of which have vocals and spoken word alongside the instrumentation. And, you know, if you're familiar with Silent Hill, then you definitely won't be surprised by what the OST sounds like. I mean, I certainly wasn't, and while I prefer the soundtrack for the second game, this one was still good, and it's one that, you know, I definitely recommend people check out, hence why it's on this list. You know, I think my main gripes with Silent Hill 3's soundtrack is that, unlike the second soundtrack, I agree with you, on its own, it's not really as free flowing to listen to, because you know, it's a bit bloated in my opinion. It doesn't feel as fluid as the second soundtrack, and there's tracks in here that I don't really care for too much about, but there are a lot of tracks I do like. You know, the ambient tracks are the main standouts for me, but there's some industrial tinged trip hop tracks in this album that are great. Plus, there's some more straightforward kind of alt rock tracks that are pretty good as well. You know, it's produced well, it's composed well, and while I haven't played the third game, I'd imagine that the soundtrack suits the vibe of the game itself incredibly well, because the second one definitely does. You know, I suppose it's not one, like I said, it's not my favorite on the list or anything like that, nor is it as good as Silent Hill 2's soundtrack in my opinion, but then again, it's still solid. I do enjoy it. I do enjoy some tracks from it. But yeah, it's pretty decent. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from the Silent Hill 3 soundtrack are Breeze in Monochrome Night, Never Forget Me, Never Forgive Me. No, Never Forgive Me, Never Forget Me, that's right. And Hometown. My least favorite track is Sun.
My favorite tracks are Breeze in Monochrome Night, Letter from the Lost Days, and Never Forgive Me, Never Forget Me. My least favorite track is Hometown.
Damn. You're really doing the main theme fucking dirty, right?
Just, no.
Okay.
Not for me.
Pain. Immeasurable. And yeah, with that in mind, that's the end of the trip hop genre essentials.
Ooh.
We fucking did it!
Yes!
See, I paid you in. And yeah, I guess we'll just end it right there. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. Hope you check out some of the records that we've mentioned on this list. There's a lot of really great stuff on here. And let us know what some of your favorite trip-hop records are down below in the comments. As well as that, you should definitely check out some of the live streams that we do every once in a while. Join the Discord server. If you want to support the content, you should go check out the Patreon and check out our own individual channels and our Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. And yeah, not much else to say there. I've been MickyT.
Nostalgia.
Good luck.
Peace and love.